Chapter 27. Vlade smirked at the chaos surrounding him. The breeze was cool against his forehead as he stood next to the town's burning buildings. They were spaced out, curving around a stream that wound throughout the settlement. He swung the sword, smiling at the weight of it in his hand as he strolled down the avenue. Ahead of him, he saw the Pelopin River. He'd heard of it from his spies, but frankly, it looked like any other river to him. He watched his soldiers as he stepped over a body. They had surrounded the town, invaded it, and now all he had left to do was kill any survivors. It had taken hardly any time at all. He held up the midnight black sword and gazed at it as he walked. It was working. He flipped it around his wrist. Childish, he knew, but he just had to. When it moved, no sound existed in its vicinity. He turned at slight movement, like a hunting cat. A fair-haired elf burst out of a fiery house with a large rolled blanket under his arm. In the window, a wreath of blue and yellow flowers withered as it burned. He ducked to the side of the house. Vlade jumped into his path. He raised the sword, and the elf's curse was lost in the aura of soundlessness. The bundle he held began to kick furiously. The Kelin commander held the sword still, and the screams of battle rushed in like a thunderclap. The elf spat at his feet and held the Kelin's gaze. "I remember that blade. I watched it burn until it was nothing but a puddle." He laid a hand on the blanket. "You are not its wielder, either." "I am now." Vlade brought the sword level and stilled it. The elf swiveled to put himself between Vlade and the kicking bundle. A small girl's voice wailed from inside. The elf spun on his heel and started to run. Vlade pivoted and lunged in the same moment, and the black blade bit noiselessly into the blanket. He felt the satisfying crunch of bone vibrate all the way up his arm, but there was no shriek or even a whimper. The elf scrambled to unwrap the blanket, but jerked to a stop as blood soaked through the cloth and spread across his hands. His mouth opened in a scream as he held the dripping bundle to his chest. He folded down onto his knees. A tendril of blonde hair escaped from the depths of the blanket. He clung tighter. The Kelin held the blade still again, and sound echoed back around them. "I've always wondered, what is it like to lose someone?" The elf cradled the bundle and bowed his head. A vicious smile split the commander's face. He brought the sword down again. Dare let her fingers trail in the water. It helped to keep her awake. Her legs were tense, and she didn't have room to stretch them out. The river was much wider and smoother here, and she'd lost count of how many streams had converged along the way. She squinted. The land and water ahead looked blurry. Maybe she was just exhausted? Dare felt the air push against her, like a strong, stationary breeze. She gasped when the sensation released her, and the river changed from glacial gray to a bright shade of blue, with a sheen of sparkling diamonds. She gripped the edge of the canoe and whipped her head back and forth, gaping. They continued as the waterway skirted a majestic forest. Crimson and gold leaves carpeted the water as the craft glided downstream. She sniffed. The river shouldn't smell like honey, she thought, but she couldn't deny her nose. This could have been the first time she saw the world, she mused, and she had only been looking through a veil throughout her entire life. She eased her fingers back into the water and felt satin running over her hand. The air was lighter and easier to breathe. "Welcome to the elven lands." Jacob grinned tightly. "It's incredible." Kelin leaned over the canoe's side. "They are gorgeous," the knight agreed. "But they mask some of the nastiest—" don't worry about it." Dare wrestled a finger against her ear. They had been constantly popping as they descended. Jacob steered the canoe until its nose kissed the mud of the bank, and then it rocked dangerously as Dare clambered out of it. Yow! She grabbed the back of her leg. Cramp! Cramp! She hauled herself onto the grass using the other leg and an elbow. Huh! She lay on the ground, realizing how solid and unyielding it felt after so much time on the water. Kelin tiptoed out of the boat. He whistled. Will you look at that? They could see the shapes of some buildings, but they blended in well with the trees. On the other side of the settlement, the world fell away over a cliff. The river curved through this hidden shelf, picked up its pace, and then plummeted into the valley below. Ahead of them, other empty canoes waited on the edge. On the water, they'd passed by several who had stopped on the little stone shores, and Dare couldn't guess at who had arrived before them. She pushed herself off the ground and tried to dust the mud off her trousers, but ended up smearing it over herself. She started toward the nearest buildings. Dare, Jacob called. Wait by the shore. She turned. Why? He sighed. We will wait until we are invited. She frowned. Is that normal, sir? The knight shook his head. No, but not one of us is a citizen of Indaleria. Kelin stretched, swaying a little for balance. I can honestly say that I never want to do that again. Dare ignored him and inched toward the buildings. Where's Caleb? Or Ed, or whatever his name actually is. The knight sighed louder. Wait by the shore. Kelin held his stomach. I don't want to wait either, sir. It's been 2 days on raw fish. I'm starving. Jacob rolled his eyes. Fine, go on up, get shot full of arrows. Dare had raised her foot at the word fine and was still holding it in the air when she turned. Are you serious, sir? Are you hungry enough to find out? No. She dropped her foot. Another canoe glided across the water and pressed into the mud beside them. A hooded figure slipped the paddle along the inside of the boat. A much smaller figure hopped to the front of the craft. Dear Kelin! Fallon grinned and waved at them. His father put a hand on his shoulder to keep the boy from jumping out. The Kelin kept his own eyes downcast. He said in a voice barely above a whisper, It is best to throw our weight behind your lot now than to wait to see if this storm passes. It won't. Jacob's mouth hung open, and he gripped his axe. How did you even get inside? Thistle tapped the elven-made boat with his foot. Thank you for the invitation. Fallon scrambled out of the canoe and hugged Kelin and Dare in turn. I don't want to believe they're back, Thistle said. I fought to put the Kelin in dark rain, Jacob replied. Thistle shrugged. I doubt we've crossed blades. Wait. Jacob narrowed his eyes. You said they're back. So? Dare asked. Storm readers always say we. Thistle's face remained blank. I have never been to dark rain. Dad. Fallon trotted back over to him. Thistle pulled his hood lower. My son and I have nowhere to run. They may have seen Talon and they will hunt him. As awful as I think Indaleria is, I know that they won't actively kill my son. Jacob's eyes flicked between Thistle and Talon. The storm reader continued, I notice that you haven't sounded the alarm yet. You might want to make it easier on yourselves and do just that. The knight didn't move. This is not yet the worst of it. If the Kelin annihilate the elves, take your guess as to their next target. Humans or dwarves. If you, dragoon, had fought my ilk, then you know they will not be sated until only Kelin are left. The silence that followed seemed to suck out the air around them. Dare heard Jacob growl in the back of his throat. Finally, he nodded. So be it. Then he let his gaze fall to Dare, Kelin, and Thalin.
It's never fair that you kids have to carry the weight of any of this. Kelin, torture, Calvar, undead.
Kelin shivered. Those cultists, they were dead. They had been killed. Thistle smirked.
To be so innocent.
But we beat them, Dare responded. Then she shifted her weight. Well, we took some of each down before we ran away, at least. Jacob shook his head.
Lucky and impressive, but remember, you were not their target. Would you swat a fly in battle?
If the fly could stab me, yes, she answered. The knight frowned.
Why do you think they didn't kill us after the prince had left? It takes a very big reward for them to risk their own immortal hides.
She grinned and cracked her knuckles. So it sounds like we'll get to do it again. But her smile faded as she saw Kelin paling. What's wrong? The young man gulped. They were so unstoppable. He gasped.
Do the Kelin do that all the time? Could it happen to us, the undead?
Thistle shrugged. Jacob tightened his lips and nodded.
It's something the Kelin did quite often before they went into battle.
Thistle's face darkened.
Those cultists deserved worse.
Dad? Thalin asked.
The Kelin love fodder.
Jacob exhaled.
Even before their immortality, they hardly risked their lives when they had so many other bodies to use. They used to march the innocent, still alive Kelin, in front of their armies to lay siege to cities.
Thistle nodded in agreement. Dare glanced back toward the buildings, intent on changing the topic. So, how long before we're invited?
I don't know.
The knight set his gaze on Thistle.
And I also don't know if there is a good time to introduce your presence without an overreaction. And just to be honest, I do not trust you an inch. But I'm not worried about taking on a single storm reader.
Thistle's expression remained impassive. He pulled up his hood. In the thickening silence, Dare tried to count the canoes laid out to dry in the grass, to see how many had made it. Around the bend, 2 new canoes came into view. On a boat, someone lit a small candle and waved it in a circle. Jacob nodded.
There is the prince, and we'll see.
Dare turned her head. People had started to melt out from the buildings. They must have been watching, even though she had seen no one peeking. In front of the silent parade, she recognized Duke Farallon. On the river, the elves in the canoes piloted them to a small, natural-looking inlet. They came to a rest in the shallow water. Amthros hopped out of one and hovered close to the other, near the physician and the prone prince. Pena and Amthros lifted Caleb out of the craft. The elves glided together into a smooth, rhythmic stream of people toward the edge of the water. Just their walk was like watching a well-practiced dance. Dare elbowed her way through. "Excuse me." She squeezed against the tightening pressure. "Excuse me, please." She pushed through the ring of people to where Caleb sat, held up by Pena. "Are you all right?" The physician's head snapped up.
You. Don't you owe us silence?
She shrugged. "Not that I know of."
"How fortunate you are that you were not injured," intoned the acerbic voice of Duke Farallon.
"Poisoned, in fact," Caleb smiled weakly. Everyone else went quiet. "However, thanks to Pena, I'm safe." He shifted forward, sitting up on his own. She opened her mouth to say something more, but hesitated. She had never realized that so many people staring could have so much weight. Actual physical weight that she could feel on her shoulders.
"Lout,"
Farallon murmured. Amthros lifted an eyebrow.
"At least she fought with us while you had gone on ahead. You missed combat by only a few lucky minutes, my lord."
The Duke frowned.
"Yes, a few of us went. I left a message with Sohir." who was killed just after you departed," the Knight of Indaleria said calmly. His words were almost serene, but Dare saw that his body had tensed. "Killed? This is unbelievable." A tremble sneaked into Farallon's voice. He dipped his chin. "We must prepare the songs of—" Behind them, someone cleared his throat. Jacob stepped forward. "Yes, this is a tragedy, but it is our duty to defend those still alive. We can mourn later. Please take advice from this soldier and save your songs." The gathered elves stared at him as if he'd spoken in another language. "What could you mean?" asked a well-dressed elf from the assembly. "More of us have died. They are gone for as long as we shall live." The knight persisted. "I regret very much that we've lost good people, many of whom had nothing to do with the Kelin banishment. However, time only stops for the dead." The Duke clenched his fist. "We are safe here." "Are we?" Thistle stepped up beside the knight and pulled back his hood to reveal his face. The elves stared. Not many of them carried weapons, but Amthros yanked out his sword. A few others knocked arrows in their bows as space widened around Thistle. Farallon moved in front of Caleb, drawing his own blade. "Dad!" Thalon lunged, trying to run forward, but Kelin held on to his shoulders. The Storm Reader stared at Amthros. He said in fluent Elvish, "I come to aid you." Farallon extended his sword point. "I will accept your surrender, and then you will tell what you know about your master's plans." The Kemen replied in a smooth tone, "I still am a prisoner of Silver Dawn, if I recall." The Duke snorted. "This is the second time you have forced your presence upon us, and the second time that you have said nothing of import. One elf trusted him." Dare swiveled to see Amthros speaking. "He may have invaluable information. Someone tried to kill him before he could speak. Therefore, someone's afraid." "There are many reasons why an elf would want this creature dead," Farallon retorted. The Knight of Indaleria raised a hand. "I think that we could listen and divine for ourselves what is useful and true." The Duke's upper lip curled. "When did you change your lyrics? I believed you to be my ally in this." "Then perhaps you thought wrongly, my lord." His gaze slid over to Thalon, and he nodded ever so slightly at the boy. "It's just we need to care for the children, even the ones with orange eyes. They're innocent. They always were." Thistle moved between the knight and his son. "This is a ruse! He has a plan!" The Duke kept his sword pointed toward the Kemen. Amthros scowled. "He killed Kemen in the ambush too. I saw him. I have never witnessed a Kemen put a blade to another." "Enough!" a voice crystallized. Caleb winced but pushed himself to stand with the physician's aid. "He has a son, a half-elven son. I do not trust his word, but the child should not lose both parents." He turned his gaze to Thistle. His face was pale and strained, but his tone was strong. "I promise that we shall treat you fairly, and not alienate you from your child." The Kemen bowed his head in assent. Kelin let go of Thalon, and the boy barreled into his father's legs. Some of the elves refused to look at Thistle as Amthros led him and Thalon away. Meanwhile, Dare and Kelin stood back, watching and waiting as Pena aided Caleb toward the settlement.